Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Munford, and this is Agential Topics. Agential Topics is a periodic meeting partially made possible by the Agential Biology Institute. The ABI, as it's now called, has been founded with the purpose of developing a physical model of agential biology. And in order to do that, we need to discover what agential biology really is. So this is a periodic meeting where we discuss that sort of thing. And today we have a special guest, Rupert Sheldrake, who's been a researcher in these sorts of topics for quite a long time. His book that we're discussing today, Morphic Resonance, was first published the year I was born, 1981. And so I'm hoping to I'm hoping to catch up. I'm hoping to catch up with a lifetime's worth of research in 30 minutes. But anyway, with very little further ado, I'll just welcome Rupert and we can begin from there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Very good to be with you all. I'll give a very brief summary of morphic resonance, then I'll talk about some of the evidence, then I'll talk about some of the implications, and hopefully that will lead into our discussion. So, for those who are not familiar with the idea, the morphic resonance is a hypothesis about memory in nature. And the idea is there's a kind of inherent memory in nature. And every kind of thing, every kind of self-organizing system has a sort of memory. Each kind of molecule, crystal, cell, tissue, organ, organism, solar system, galaxy, all these self-organizing systems have a kind of memory according to this hypothesis. And the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. So the idea there's a memory in nature is not familiar in Western thought or philosophy because it's been dominated by Platonic thinking. Ever since the ancient Greeks, Western thought's been dominated by the idea that there are timeless models or forms or archetypes or mathematical laws outside space and time that somehow control everything in space and time. The phenomena we see are reflections of these eternal realities, according to Plato. And in the 17th century, the idea of Platonic type laws got built into science, into the foundations of science, through the idea of mathematical laws of nature controlling all of nature. And that's really been the paradigm ever since. Even when the sciences moved on to an evolutionary cosmology with the Big Bang theory, which became orthodox in 1966, the idea of eternal laws of nature remained. So the idea was that all the laws of nature were there at the very moment of the Big Bang, fixed like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code. And all the constants of nature were fixed too. So that's the kind of background assumption. However, in Eastern thought, it's the opposite. In Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, it's taken for granted there's a kind of memory in nature. And when I first thought of morphic resonance, which was in 1973, I was working in Cambridge in developmental biology. I then went to India, where I worked in an international agricultural research institute. And when I talked to Indian colleagues about morphic resonance, instead of shock and horror, as it used to happen when in the biochemistry department at Cambridge, and you know, people just being unable to understand what I was saying, I got a response the exact opposite. People were completely blasé. You know, they say, "Oh, that is an ancient idea. Rishis in caves have thought of this thousands of years ago. You know, everyone in India knows this, etc." So I got the exact opposite response. I said, "Well, in that case, why don't you try and prove it?" You know, within Eastern thought, memory, as I say, is taken for granted. Anyway. What I'm in my particular hypothesis of morphic resonance, the idea is that similar things, self-organizing systems, resonate across space and time from the past to the present in this process I call morphic resonance, which is based on similarity and based on the similarity of vibrational patterns in 3 dimensions. It doesn't apply to non-self-organizing systems. Tables, chairs, digital computers, and so on don't have an inherent memory. But things that are self-organizing do, according to this hypothesis. And this slide shows the way that nature is organized according to the holistic model. This is not my original idea. It's a widespread idea among people who take a holistic as opposed to reductionist view of nature. Nature is organized at many different levels. The small circles could be subatomic particles in atoms, the next level up in molecules, in crystals, or they could be organelles in cells, in tissues, in organs, in organisms, in societies of organisms, in ecosystems, in planetary systems, and so on. The same structure also applies to language. There could be phonemes in words, in syllables, sentences, paragraphs, and so forth. So many things in nature have this nested hierarchical kind of organization. And what I'm suggesting is that each level is organized by what I call a morphic field. At quantum theory level, these are the quantum fields of quantum physics. At the developmental biology level, they're the morphogenetic fields, the form-shaping fields that shape and maintain developing organisms and maintain their form once they've developed. So the idea is that in each of these self-organizing layers, there's a collective memory from similar ones in the past. Each individual draws upon it and contributes to it. So this is not a specifically biological theory, as I just said. It applies across the board. And so that's just a very brief overview of the hypothesis. The other key thing is that when a given crystal or a given cell or a given bacterium or a given plant resonates with similar ones in the past, they're all slightly different. So it doesn't give an exact, precise, sharply defined field. What it gives is a probabilistic model. And these pictures are composite photographs of average scientists at the John Innes Research Institute in Norwich, England. And these were made by superimposing 30 different female scientist photos and 45 different male scientist photos. And what you have is a kind of average scientist, a probability structure of their face. Now, I think that the morphic fields are probability structures, and I think they work by modifying indeterminate things like quantum probabilities, biasing probabilities of otherwise indeterminate events. So that's how I think they work. So now, is this theory testable? Well, yes, it's very testable in many realms of biology and physics and chemistry. And so what I'll do now is just run through several different areas where it can be tested to give a better feel of what it's saying. In the realm of chemistry, this suggests that when you make a new compound and crystallize it for the first time, there won't be a morphic field for those crystals because they haven't existed before. The exact lattice structure won't be readily defined. So the first time it crystallizes, a new field comes into being. Now, I'm not dealing here with the question of creativity. That's a separate issue. I'm just dealing with a theory of repetition. Morphic resonance is a theory of repetition. What I'm suggesting is that once it's crystallized once, then it should be easier to crystallize everywhere else in the world. And the more often it crystallizes, the easier it should get. The habit should become more habitual, more probable. And actually, it's well known that when you make new compounds, it may take years before you can get them to crystallize. But once they've been crystallized, they tend to crystallize more and more easily all over the world. There are some compounds that were made in one form, and then a new kind of crystal comes along and takes over. Fashions change. This happened with ritonavir, which is part of an AIDS drug that was made for several years by Abbott Laboratories, and then a new form turned up and suddenly it was everywhere, and they could not get the original form back again because the new fashion had taken over and then it spread everywhere. Well, chemists are well aware that this happens with crystallization, but they've always explained it in other ways, by the carrying of nuclei or seeds of crystallization processes from one lab to another on the beards of migrant chemists. That's a common theory. The other one is that they're caused by microscopic particles of previous crystals being wafted around the world in the air as dust particles. So I'm suggesting the same thing should happen even if you exclude migrant chemists and filter out dust particles. That experiment has already happened, in the sense it's common knowledge it happens, but the rigorous version hasn't been done. A more easy way of looking at crystals is through melting points, because this hypothesis predicts that when a crystal's been crystallized frequently and existed in a crystallized form more often, the habits of that form, the field, the morphic field, gets stronger. And if it's stronger, it's harder to disrupt it. And how you disrupt a crystal field is by heating up the crystal, and when it reaches a particular temperature, it melts. So the melting point gives a measure of the stability. And so this hypothesis makes the improbable prediction that the melting points of new compounds should go up as time goes on. And now you wouldn't think that normally, because you look them up in the laboratory, at least you used to, when you had physical libraries in the CRC Handbook of Physical Constants, or the Merck Index. And in each of those, they're listed as physical constants, the melting points. So I decided to see whether they really do change. Do the constants change? Well, normally, people just look at the latest version of the CRC Handbook of Physical Constants, like the 45th edition. They forget what's in the 44th, 43rd, and previous editions. I managed to get out the older editions from the Patent Office Library and found that actually melting points did change. They, on the whole, went up. And a Canadian chemist, Klaus Orr, kindly did a study of hundreds of melting points for me, he used technical literature, not just handbooks, but the peer-reviewed papers. And in the next slide, you see what happens to the melting points of a whole range of organic chemicals, synthetic organic chemicals. As you see, the vast majority of them have gone up. The melting points have gone up, in some cases by 70 degrees or more. If it was just random error, you'd expect them to go down as much as they go up. But it's very clear there's a bias in favor of going up. So now, when I talk to chemists about this, they say, well, obviously, there must be a simple explanation, and the explanation must be that chemists get better at making compounds as time goes on, and so they're more pure, and therefore melting points go up because impurities lower the melting point. So I said, well, how do you know that the later samples are purer? They said, well, they must be, because the melting points have gone up. So that's the state of the art of the discussion in chemistry labs at the moment about this phenomenon. So to try and move things on, what I've been doing is comparing the melting points of compounds that crystallize in nature, where they've been crystallizing for millions of years. You wouldn't expect to see any increment over the last 100 years in labs if they've been crystallizing for millions of years, whereas chemists might well have got better at preparing them or crystallizing them or purifying them. And I compare those with synthetic compounds that didn't exist, as far as we know, until relatively recently. And so I've made a series of comparisons, and here is one comparison here. This is salicin, which occurs in willow bark and other plants, and it naturally occurs, and you see the melting point of salicin's hardly changed through the 20th century. And we compare this with aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid, between 1914 and 1996. The melting point increased by over 6 degrees. aspirin was first synthesized in the 1870s. I haven't got the earlier data here, but I would expect that to show, lower melting points still. And another comparison here, here's cocaine, which crystallizes in the leaves of coca plants when they're dried. And here's cocaine hydrochloride, the cocaine of commerce, made by extracting with hydrochloric acid, showing an increase. So these are just some examples. I've got other ones showing that there really does seem to be a change in melting points. Now, obviously, a lot of people are going to say, well, there must be other explanations or whatever. And the ideal thing would be to do an experiment, taking newly formed chemicals, crystallizing some of them but not others, and seeing if only the ones that are crystallized go up. And this should be measurable all over the world. Well, the theory should be testable also in the realm of molecular biology. Protein folding is very hard to predict from first principles because the number of possible conformations of a given primary structure of a protein runs into the billions. And if they explored them all at random, it would take, literally billions of years for a protein to find the right lowest energy conformation. In fact, a protein like ribonuclease folds up within about 2 minutes. So something's going on, and it's proved impossible to predict protein structure from first principles, partly because normal predictions based on energy minimization. You find the position at the bottom of an energy well where the protein is the lowest energy point. But because proteins can take up so many conformations, there isn't a single lower energy point. There's lots of them. And this is called the multiple minimum problem. And the protein finds one of those and not the others. And it's not predictable from first principles. Now, Google's AlphaFold is brilliant at predicting protein structures, but not from first principles. It's based on a huge database of known structures. And so it's a bit like AI facial recognition. It's not because it understands the morphogenesis of faces and the molecular biology of cells in facial development and so on. It's simply because it has a vast database. So that's how Google's AlphaFold works. But this theory predicts if you make a new protein and you see how long it takes to fold, if you make it lots and lots of times, it should fold faster all over the world. No one's done that experiment yet because it's quite hard to make new proteins. It's getting easier. Now, in developmental biology, the hypothesis suggests that if you have a new pattern of development that hasn't happened before, it should be easier for the same pattern to happen again, the more often it happens. And there have been experiments that suggest this may be the case. This at the top is a fruit fly, a normal fruit fly, and at the bottom is a four-winged fruit fly where the halt hairs have been converted into wings. And the mutations that cause this are called bithorax mutations. But you can also produce four-winged flies epigenetically by changing the environment of the developing flies. And this is something that C.H. Waddington did in the 1950s in his lab in Edinburgh. And he found that if you exposed the eggs of the four-winged fly embryos 4 hours after laying to diethyl ether, then some of the flies turned out to have 4 wings. Not a matter of mutations, it was a developmental disturbance, a bit like thalidomide disturbing human embryology. It's not based on mutations, even though it mimics. That's why it's called a phenocopy. And it mimics they mimic the mutations, the effects of mutations. Now, Mei Wan Ho at the Open University did some experiments with her colleagues, exposing fruit flies repeatedly to diethyl ether. Each generation, they exposed the eggs to diethyl ether. And the first generation, they were about 2%, the next about 5%, and so on. And after 11 generations, they got up to about 34% of four-winged flies. There was no selection going on here. In fact, selection was probably working against the four-winged flies because they tended to get stuck in the medium more than the other ones. And then the dotted lines show what happens if you stop giving them ether. They relax. The percentage of four-winged flies is still way above zero, but it goes down gradually. Now, this could be an epigenetic effect because of modifications of the methylation of the DNA, modifications of histones, etc. When these experiments were done, epigenetics wasn't being studied in the way that it is now. But it could also be a morphic resonance effect. And the way to test for morphic resonance as opposed to epigenetic inheritance is to do the same experiment again. Do exactly the same thing again, starting with flies that have never been exposed to ether, and expose them to ether. And then, according to morphic resonance, you should get a higher proportion undergoing this transformation the second time round. And in fact, Ho did that for the first two generations. And in the first generation, the first time round, it was about 2.5%, in the second generation, about 6%. The second time round, it was 10% in the first generation and nearly 20% in the second generation. So this is the kind of experiment that can be done in the realm of developmental biology to test morphic resonance effects. And it's become increasingly relevant in the light of recent research on epigenetics, because epigenetics is really about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. In the 20th century, this was a huge taboo. When I was a student at Cambridge, people just mentioned the word Lysenko, the Russian epigeneticist, or Lamarck, and the kind of hissing sound, like the pantomime villain, these were the really bad guys. And because the Soviet Union, under Lysenko in its biology, took up what we now call epigenetics, the inheritance of acquired characters, in the West, this became even more taboo. It was politically polarized, and neo-Darwinians utterly denied, dogmatically denied any possibility of inheritance of acquired characters. However, when it was rebranded epigenetic inheritance around 2000, it became much more acceptable, and it's now very widely researched. There are now experiments going on. Well, many of you will know the famous ones with mice called Inheriting the Fears of Fathers. Male mice exposed to acetophenone, given an electric shock, are reversed to acetophenone thereafter. And they're then bred with female mice that have never seen or heard or smelled acetophenone. And their children and their grandchildren are reversed to acetophenone. They freeze with fear whenever they smell it. This was written up in Nature, called Inheriting the Fears of Fathers. And it's assumed that this is because of some molecular change in the sperm, iRNA, or some change in the DNA, methylation or something. It's inherited chemically, epigenetically. I think it could well be a morphic resonance effect. And I think a lot of morphic epigenetic effects could be explained by morphic resonance. Now, morphic resonance can also be tested in the realm of behavior, and there's a famous series of experiments that I discuss in my books done by McDougall at Harvard in the 1920s, training rats to escape from a water maze. And in successive generations, the rats escaped much faster from the water maze. This is the number of errors on the vertical axis against generations. They were making more than 200 errors, and they ended up with about 35 or 30 errors after 22 generations. And this was really controversial at the time because it seemed to show the inheritance of acquired characters. And as I just mentioned, this was an incredibly hot topic and considered impossible by most scientists in the West. And so people repeated this at Edinburgh and at Melbourne, Australia, and they found their rats started off learning about as fast as the Harvard ones had left off. And in Melbourne, they did control experiments with rats that had not been descended from parents that had not been trained. And they did just as well. The improvement happened in those just as much as in the ones descended from trained parents. So this, to me, looks like a morphic resonance effect. And this is repeatable. One can do further experiments. I did some experiments on morphic resonance in the learning of day-old chicks. There's a British scientist, Stephen Rose, who used to work on memory in chicks. And Stephen Rose was incredibly opposed to morphic resonance. He was almost fanatically opposed to it. And he was a skilled polemicist. He was a Marxist and, very committed materialist on ideological grounds. So I wrote some columns. We both wrote columns in the newspaper The Guardian, and I wrote a column about morphic resonance and learning. And he wrote columns attacking me and saying this was pseudoscience and so on. And then finally he threw down a gauntlet and said, well, he invited me to test this seemingly absurd hypothesis in his lab. So all my friends said, don't do it, it'll be biased, it's totally under his control, etc. But I thought, okay, well, no one else has offered to do this, so I accepted. And we did some experiments with day-old chicks using a protocol he was using on a regular basis. They peck at a small light-emitting diode. Day-old chicks peck at any shiny object. And after they've pecked at it, they're given an injection of lithium chloride that makes them sick, and they'll never peck at that color again. So we picked a color they hadn't ever used before, namely yellow light-emitting diodes, compared it with a chrome bead as the control. And with the chrome bead, they didn't get the injection of lithium chloride, and they went on pecking it just the same as before. But as soon as they pecked the yellow light-emitting diode and had the injection, it made them sick. They wouldn't peck it again. It's a simple conditioning, almost Pavlovian conditioning. So the experiment was to do exactly the same experiment every day with a fresh batch of chicks. And according to morphic resonance, they should show an increasing aversion to pecking it, measured in terms of a longer latency, a longer time before they peck it, a pause. Some didn't peck at all, and then some delayed pecking it. And in relation to the controls, the question is, would they show a greater latency of pecking as time went on in subsequent batches? And the results showed exactly that. It was a significant effect. And each of these on the x-axis is a separate new generation of chicks. And the vertical axis is the relative latency relative to controls. Well, so this is the kind of experiment that can be done. Of course, it didn't resolve the issue because Rose then said, well, this must have some trivial explanation. It couldn't possibly be morphic resonance. And so it just resulted, as these things usually do, in heated disputes. But anyway, so I'm not saying that this must be the truth. I'm just saying these are the results we got. And it would be wonderful to do this kind of experiment again, but it's very hard to find labs who are willing to do it. So now, it can also be tested in the human realm. There have been quite a few tests on morphic resonance in human learning. But I think the most interesting data are from IQ tests, because this has nothing to do with morphic resonance testing. No one does IQ tests to test morphic resonance. Whereas the morphic resonance tests tend to be disputed, and some have given very positive results, others are more ambiguous. But it was discovered by James Flynn, a psychologist, that average IQ test results had been going up very strikingly since IQ tests were invented. And it's called the Flynn effect. And at first it was discovered with Japanese data, and there were lots of concern in America. The Japanese are getting smarter than the Americans and so on. That's when everyone was afraid the Japanese would overtake rather than the Chinese. And so then people looked at the US data and found those had gone up too, and not to be outdone, people in other countries found theirs had all gone up as well. So the Flynn effect, people have tried to explain it with nutrition, more exposure to testing. All sorts of explanations have been offered. None of them are very convincing. And I think it could well be a morphic resonance effect. So anyway, that's circumstantial evidence. And there are lots of other circumstantial evidence that human skills like skateboarding and stuff seem to be getting easier. Now, I've done various tests with human learning. Let me just show one of them. This one is a puzzle picture. And this test was suggested to me by Nicholas Humphrey, who's a psychologist and a friend of mine. And the idea was that puzzle pictures like this, most people don't get what it is. And if you look at it, you may or may not see an underlying picture. But when you're shown the answer, and then you go back to the actual picture, probably you'll get it straight away. Now, this is one-shot learning that takes a matter of seconds, and it's permanent. If you were shown this picture again in 5 years' time, you'd probably get it straight away. I mean, this is well known from research in psychology. Humphrey's idea was, what if we showed this picture on television to millions of people in one country? Would people in other countries get it quicker? Well, that was in the days when television was in one country instead of spread all around the world by the internet. So we actually did this experiment on BBC television, testing people in Germany and America, and found that with a control picture that wasn't shown, and it worked. We got a significant increase of Germans, but not Americans, recognizing the picture. We then tried it the other way around, with Germans showing the picture and people in Britain, and then gave the opposite result. It made it harder for British people to recognize the test picture. No one's explained that. They're puzzling results, but they were interesting because the skeptical view would be there'd be no difference, and actually we got significant effects. These experiments are now almost impossible to do because of the internet, and they were really hard to set up. They involved testing lots and lots of independent groups of people. But I mentioned this just as an example of the kinds of tests that could be done. It would be possible to devise internet-based experiments for testing morphic resonance, and I'm working on some ideas right now. Well, the implications of this, I'll run through them very quickly. Morphic resonance would give us a completely different view of inheritance. It would show us that the genes code for what we know they code for, the sequence of amino acids in proteins, and some are involved in control of protein synthesis. They're certainly not a program for the shape of an arm or a leg or a flower or a seed pod, which is what many people used to assume. And in fact, with the Human Genome Project, with genome-wide association studies, it's now become clear that a very large part of human heredity isn't explained by genes. This is called the missing heritability problem. And that's exactly what you'd expect on the basis of morphic resonance, that if most inheritance is through morphic resonance, through form and behavior and instinct, you wouldn't expect to find it in the genes, and no amount of genome-wide associations would reveal it. Now, the situation is complicated by epigenetic inheritance, which I think can explain some of the missing heritability problem, but not all of it. And this is why in new experiments on inheritance, it's important to have a morphic resonance control, like the ones I showed with Mei-Wan Ho's experiments. If you say, well, this is just epigenetic, then it shouldn't affect untreated organisms, whereas morphic resonance would. So it's possible to distinguish between them experimentally. Morphic resonance also means that studies on identical twins would be heavily confounded by morphic resonance because they're so similar. They strongly resonate with each other, even if separated soon after birth. And this means that those studies on identical twins, the nature-nurture studies, which led many people to estimate that most characteristics were very heavily determined by genes, led to a kind of genetic determinism that underlay the Human Genome Project and the expenditure of billions of dollars, thinking this would give us all the secrets of life, or most of them. The identical twin studies are usually interpreted in nature, nurture, environment, genetics. Morphic resonance provides a third way of looking at them, because you'd expect twins separated after birth or not separated to resonate with each other, and characteristics that one of them might acquire to be acquired or made easier to acquire by the other. And this would give you a false reading if you assume that all these similarities are genetic. And I think that's one reason that the missing heritability problem is so shocking, because people have a very inflated view of genes because of identical twin studies. Now, when you come to the question of what's the most similar organism to any given one in the past, what organism in the past is most similar to me, the answer is me. And in your case, it's you. And on the basis of similarity, morphic resonance would mean that we'd resonate most strongly with ourselves in the past. And self-resonance, I think, is what helps to understand the stability of form in organisms, even though there's a turnover of cells and proteins and so forth. There's a stability of form, I think, from self-resonance. And I think that this is the basis of memory. The usual assumption, as you all know, is that memories are stored in the brain as physical traces, modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins, changed DNA or RNA, even in some theories. People have tried to find memory traces for a very long time, and they failed again and again. The latest attempt was through very detailed work on wave patterns in the brains of mice as they learn mazes. They now have much more sophisticated electrodes than they used to for measuring the details. And it turned out that mice have a very characteristic wave pattern, complex wave pattern in their brains when they learn something or when they're remembering something. This is a representation of the wave pattern in a brain, the time axis on the right. The changing waves over regions of the brains of the cortex of the mouse when it's remembering a maze that it's learned. And then people said, well, okay, we've at last found all the areas which are involved in memory on the cortex. But in fact, what happens then is that when you measure it again, you find the same wave pattern, but it's moved a bit. It's not in the same cells. And this is now called representational drift. The representation drifts around. Well, this kind of resonant pattern fits very well with the morphic resonance theory of memory. Doesn't fit very well with the idea of everything being frozen into synapses or crystallized into phosphorylated proteins. So I think self-resonance helps to explain memory, normal memory. I think it also helps to explain things like family fields. In family constellation therapy, people have family patterns from past generations, which I think could well be explained by morphic resonance. And in the field of family constellation therapy, morphic resonance is the mainstream explanation that most therapists adopt. I mean, there's not many fields where morphic resonance is mainstream, but in that area it is, because it seems to make such good sense of the actual data. Okay, well, just one more point. I think morphic resonance could also explain what I call evolutionary plagiarism, where very similar patterns turn up in distant groups of animals, like marsupial mammals in Australia and in Europe, not placental mammals in the Old World. They have many parallels in evolution, and I think that these might well depend on morphic resonance. And Simon Conway Morris, in his work on evolutionary convergences, has shown that these are much more common than people used to think. He explains them platonically. He's a Platonist, and he thinks there are eternal archetypes for eyes and wings and things like, and feathers and things like that, and that these just keep getting rediscovered in the course of evolution. I think that they could well be morphic resonance effects. And so really, when we come down, if we move beyond reductionism and we're looking for agency, it really comes down to a question of, is it historically based, or is it Platonic? And that seems to me the main choice, that if we're going to have morphogenetic fields, are they reflections of eternal archetypes, or are they habits that have been built up over time? And I myself think that in an evolutionary universe and an evolutionary biology, morphic resonance fits better than Platonism as an explanatory model for these forms. It doesn't explain creativity, as I mentioned before, and there might be a role for Platonic archetypes or a divine imagination or something like that. But science is primarily about explaining repetitions, not creativity. And so I think that morphic resonances can help us to explain the habits of nature, even though it can't explain the creativity that's also a part of the evolutionary process. Well, that's a very brief summary, and I've moved very fast. I hope not too fast. So
That was
there we are.
wonderful. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Rupert. This is a marvelous theory and so interesting and creative, and it touches so many open questions. And it's really it's so valuable for us here. So what's going to happen now? I'm going to ask a couple of clarifying questions to sort of get us started off, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Some of you guys have already found the raise hand button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you click on React, there'll be a raise hand button and also a lower hand. So we'll just kind of keep a queue of questions. Bear in mind that as we go into discussions, I'm going to keep people muted by default. So if you open your mouth to ask a question, just be sure you're not muted and unmute yourself. And if it looks like you're still muted, I'll try to help. So anyway, great. Thanks so much. My first question for you, Rupert, is just kind of clarification here. So we have the common sense idea that knowledge arrives to us in waves of various sorts, and when we learn things, just as humans, we can learn through these various types of fields that happen in vacuum, like electromagnetism, gravity, and the quantum fields. Those three happen in vacuum, and then also acoustic waves, happen in matter. And all, well, maybe not all matter, but most matter carries waves as well. So if I'm understanding you right, your postulate is that in self-organizing systems, which applies to proteins, crystals, organisms, there are other fields, morphic fields, right? So the question I have about morphic fields is that in some places it seems like your prediction is, or your understanding is, that they're totally non-local. And when something is learned somewhere in the world, it's basically the propensity spreads all over the world and also spreads through time, forwards and backwards. And so the intuition I have about knowledge is sort of, my default is like that it's some sort of structural coupling, that there's like, if I know something about the world, it means that there's some correspondence in me to the world. And so I see it as a sort of perspective. And so can you elaborate on how a perspective doesn't apply here, or how a subjectivity could be non-local?
Well, good question. I mean, first of all, I'm saying I think the morphic fields are local. They're within and around the system they organize. And the closest parallel, in fact, what may be the morphic fields of subatomic particles are the quantum fields. If you think of an electron, it has an electron field, or it's a vibration in an electron field. It also has an electric charge. But you can't explain an atom just in terms of electric fields. You need quantum fields as well. And I think that the morphic fields and electromagnetic fields are very closely linked. I think that probably morphic fields work through electromagnetic fields. I think that's probably the interface with most physical systems. Like Mike Levin's wonderful pictures of developing newts where you can see the eye spot appearing in the electric field. Now, I don't think electricity by itself can create patterns like that. And if it's generated by the cells and their different electrical behavior, then something has to pattern them. And I think that's the morphic fields as the primary patterning influence, and it's local. Now, morphic resonance is non-local. It connects morphic fields across space and time from the past to the present. I don't think it works from the future to the past or from the present to the past. I think it's unidirectional. I think there's an arrow of time, and I think it's a memory principle. It would be untestable if it worked from the future, because we don't know what will happen in the future, so you could never really test it. But that would be a scientific inconvenience, but I think on theoretical grounds, I think it's unidirectional. So now when we come to the question of the correspondence in the world, I apply this field theory to perception and to the activity of the brain. And I think that when you do something, when you see something, when I'm looking at the screen in front of me now, the conventional view is that light comes from the screen, goes into my eyes, inverted images, changes in the cells, impulses up the optic nerve, changes in the brain. And then, mysteriously, I form a three-dimensional full-color model of reality, everything I'm seeing around me, inside my brain, a representation. I don't think it's like that at all. I think that what we do is project out the images, which are in, I think our perceptual fields are a kind of morphic field with a kind of built-in memory out there as well as in here. And that when I look at something, I'm projecting out an image that coincides with what I'm looking at, unless I'm hallucinating or having an illusion. But when I look at something, my image coincides with it. And I think we actually affect things by looking at them. That's why I do a lot of research on the sense of being stared at. 95% of people have had the feeling of turning around to find someone staring at them. And I've done lots of research on this, hundreds of thousands of trials. I now have an app that works on mobile phones. The sense of being stared at is called scoposthesia. The app's called iSense Training, EYE, iSense Training. And I'm at present have groups of people who are trying to get better at it by practice. In martial arts, people actually train to get better at it. So I think that the point about the observer and the observed and the connection with what we're seeing, I don't think there's a form of something out there and then a representation of it inside the brain. I think that the form we project out is in our perceptual field, and it normally corresponds with the form of what we're looking at. And the way our minds work through morphic fields is very similar to the way nature works through morphic fields, which is, I think, why we can understand nature and the form and recognize forms.
Awesome. Okay. That was great. I just have one more question. It's kind of a tricky one though. So let me see if I can ask it in a clear way. So, understand this as an organism is an antenna. I mean, you might say like a mind is an antenna, but there are these fields that a self-organizing system can tune into, can pick up on. And so these are creodes, Waddington's creodes. And so that concept makes total sense. And I think most people on this call are pretty familiar with that. But you mentioned, and this is something we talked about, and you mentioned that you don't have a theory of creativity of the formation of new creodes. I mean, in the book, you have, some examples where suppose an organism is stuck between two creodes and they have to sort of tread along the middle, or two organisms fuse for some reason, or they fuse temporarily, behaviorally, and so it gets transferred from one to the other. And so those are really fascinating. But I agree they're not that great because they're kind of blending inheritance in a way. So the question is challenging. So if we have to depend on an additional theory of creativity of the creation of new creodes, my question is, doesn't that theory of the creation of new ones, doesn't that already give you repetition? because presumably there's, fixed certainties or truths or regularities in the universe already that we can depend on. And so if those creodes can be created anew from the regularities of the universe, um, it seems like they would be created again and again just by the virtue of how they got created in the first place. Does that make
That's a
sense?
very, very good question. Well, this, the, there are theories of creativity. I mean, in my book, as you know, I discuss several theories of creativity. I don't think that scientists need to commit to any one of them, because I think that creativity is more of a metaphysical than a physical question. But the thing is that even when you think about theories of creativity, there's a deep division between the theories that are available. The Platonic theory is the one that's always dominated Western thought. You know, that there are fixed archetypes up there. And for Plato, it didn't matter because he believed the universe went in cycles and it was like endless cycles. It wasn't an evolutionary view. But if you have an evolutionary view, then you'd have to say that all the archetypes of the dinosaurs and all possible animals would have been there at the moment of the Big Bang, and indeed before the Big Bang, because Platonic realms are timeless. All the Platonic forms of all animals in all possible universes and all possible planets would all be there in the divine mind before there were even any universes at all. That would be the Platonic view, taking it to its logical conclusion. Or you have the view that Bergson was so keen on, and I'm very much influenced by Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. In his book Creative Evolution, it's around 1900 it was published, he argued that evolution is made up as it goes along, and any Platonic theory of evolution that sees it as just dusting off a pre-existing archetype whose moment for manifestation has come is really avoiding the problem of creativity, because it's saying there is no creativity, everything's already there. And he said, we find it so hard to think about creativity where something new comes from what wasn't there before, because our thinking is so based on so and so equals that. All science is based on equations, so what was before equals what after, mass, momentum, energy, charge, etc., equals on the other side of the equation. But creativity doesn't fit that model. So to avoid it, we say it's all there to start with. Whereas he thought that the universe is made up as it goes along, and he talked about if there's God, he's le Dieu qui se crée, the God who creates himself, that it's a creative evolution is truly creative. I prefer that view. I think that things are made up as they go along, depending on the circumstances. And when we look at creativity, if you just look at random mutations as they're normally conceived, just take the standard mutational theory, there are lots and lots of mutations all the time, and the vast majority of mutations are harmful and they're weeded out. Some succeed and they become, the organism develops new habits. And if you look in the human realm, there's the number of people posting new tunes, new songs, new photos, new videos, new ideas, huge, but only some get favored by the market forces and become widely, only a few people become celebrities. Lots of people try. And when you look at the patent reports, all sorts of gadgets and new ideas file for patents. And how many of them ever become products that you've heard of? Very few. So your argument, you see, would also have to sustain all these other things that don't make it in evolutionary terms. There are even more Platonic forms. There are billions more, orders of magnitude more, because you'd also have to have the same rule that would apply to all possibilities. Now, I think this is more economical theory, that if things are made up as they go along and something's unstable, it won't work. So new possibilities happen. If you break the old habits, new things can happen. And they may be rather unstable fluctuations to start with. And some may not work, but some might work and get repeated and become increasingly habitual. And then you'd have an evolutionary process that can make things up according to what's happening at the time. And ones that really work and are repeated stabilize. I mean, that's how I see it anyway.
Wow, that's beautiful. Um, Yeah, I'm tempted to ask one more thing really quick, which is it seems like it depends on the intentions in a certain respect of the intentions of the agent or of the system. Like, so for example, the create of the rats escaping from the maze. Well, the one that forms is the one created by the rats that successfully escaped, right? Not the ones that failed. I mean, it could have been that they, a create formed that caused them to fail just before they escaped over and over. And that was the one that spread across the world.
Well, I think that organisms automatically have an intention to survive and reproduce. I think that's a given for all forms of life as an ultimate goal or intention. And a rat struggling in a water maze, which if it doesn't escape from it drowns, has a strong intention to find a way out. And so most creativity happens within the already existing purposes or intentions or goals of survival and reproduction. You know, even, creativity of the kind of technological kind, making a better mousetrap, there's the intention of catching mice. That's not creative about the way we deal with mice. It doesn't say, oh no, you shouldn't kill mice, or you shouldn't trap mice, you should just learn to live with them or ask them to go away or something. It's not, it takes for granted trapping mice as the end or goal. It just finds a better way of doing it. And so I would say most creativity in the biological realm is about better ways of surviving or reproducing. And so the goal or purpose is already, the intention is already there. And in the case of the rats in the water maze, there were two exits. One was dimly lit and the other was brightly lit. And if one of them they got an electric shock and the other they didn't. And they had to learn that the dimly lit one was the one they could get out of without the electric shock. And it took them lots of attempts and lots of electric shocks before they learned it. That graph showed the number of attempts before they got it right every time. And as time went on, they needed fewer and fewer attempts to learn to avoid the lighted exit and go for the dim one. But they were certainly motivated to get out of the water.
Thank you. Okay, we'll open it up for questions. Guys, ask your question, and then if you have follow-up, go ahead and put them in the chat, since we've got such a big group. Looks like Wayne, you're first.
How you doing, Rupert? Thank you very much. First of all, I have a couple questions. One of them is specific, um, having to do with morphic resonance effects and protein folding, and how you might differentiate between, say, what Yanni Hoffmeyer is now would say is like formal cause in cells, essentially the cellular milieu, or you have heat shock proteins, particular electrostatic potentials that exist in the cell that get these proteins to form in a certain way. So the specific question here is, if it were largely a morphic resonance effect, you would expect that even outside of that cellular milieu, you would get more and more rapid folding of the proteins into this nascent structure that is biologically active. Are there experiments that have been done that that differentiate these two effects?
Well, a lot of the standard older research on protein folding was done in vitro, like the work on ribonuclease. You get purified ribonuclease, you denature it with urea. It's a simple way to denature proteins, high concentrations of urea. So it unfolds. And then you get rid of the urea, you dialyze it off. And then the protein folds, and you can study its folding dynamics in vitro. I mean, that's how a lot of protein folding research was done. Now, obviously, in the cell where you've got structured water, all sorts of calcium ions, all sorts of things going on, electric fields, these will affect the process. But most protein, well, not most, but many of the proteins that have been studied from the point of view of folding dynamics are purely in vitro, without any of these complicating factors, intracellular factors. And so the experiments I would propose would be in vitro experiments where you take a new protein or a modified version of an old protein, unfold it, and then study how long it takes to fold. And with enzymes, it's quite easy to do this. What you do is you get the enzyme and you simply assay enzyme activity. And when it's folded up in vitro, it becomes active. Before that, it's not active. So you look at the time lag before it becomes active, and you can, using quite simple techniques, measure the folding dynamics.
Right. So I mean, but it's just that for eukaryotic proteins, especially because they're involved in so many different processes and so many different complexes, that are combinatoric, they typically don't fold in vitro, right? I mean, if you've got proteins there and you don't have the proper cellular context, they don't fold.
No, some of them need other proteins to help them fold. But I'm just saying that the classic work on protein folding has been done on those that you can fold in vitro because it's easier to work with them.
Right. I'm just not sure how the experiment will be done. I'm just trying to differentiate. It may be the case that both effects are important, is that there is a morphic resonance effect and there also is cellular milieu or formal cause in that.
Oh, yes. Well, I think morphic resonance is a formal cause, actually. I mean, my hypothesis, when my first book, A New Science of Life, the subtitle is The Hypothesis of Formative Causation. So it's really, it is a hypothesis of formal causes. And I think fields in general are formal causes. And I think, we misunderstand them if we think they're just mechanistic causes in the normal way.
Exactly.
I have a demo of that, actually. I don't know how long we've got, but I could actually give you a live demo of what I mean, how a field acts as a formal cause. Have we got time?
Well, we've got an hour. Yeah.
Well, if you just leave, if I can, for a second, I can just go and get my kit from next door. Hang on.
Great.
While he's looking, the other comment there that's in the chat has to do with the connection between morphic fields and spaces of potential in the Whiteheadian sense. So for the folks that follow Whitehead, especially people like Timothy Eastman, where the point is that reality is not just what's actualized. Reality is both what's actualized and what's potential, and there's a feedback between these two things going on all the time. And
so let's see. Wayne,
reorganizing.
Wayne, let's let him.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, can you see this? This is a Galton board, which is. Can you see it all right, or is the reflection too much?
Let me see if I can. Can you stop sharing? That might be better.
I don't know how to. Wait a minute. I'll try to stop
It'll
sharing.
be down. There'll be a green button at the bottom center of your screen, and you should be able to unshare.
If I click share, stop share. There's a red button at the top. There we are.
There we go. Perfect.
Can you see better now? Okay, this is called a Galton board, and there are lots of little ball bearings here, and these are lots of pegs, and they when I turn it over, they fall down. I don't know if you can see that. Oh, I got it wrong way round. That's why you can't. You see what happens is the balls fall down through these pegs and they give you a normal distribution curve. That's why it's called a Galton board. And these are brilliant devices. I mean, hours of harmless fun. Now, what happens now, I'm now going to bias what is otherwise a random process by means of a field. Now, I've fitted some magnets on the field, a pair of magnets, and the balls are going to fall through the magnets, and obviously they're steel balls and magnets going to affect them. And so what you see there is we've affected a random distribution of balls with a field. Now this field has lost no energy in doing this. It's non-energetic. The magnetic field has not lost magnetism. It's not expended energy. You can do it over and over again, thousands and thousands of times, and the magnet won't wear out. So formal causes are different from energetic causes, and this shows how a formal cause of a magnet, a field, is actually affecting a random pattern. It's an agent, but it's a formative agent, not an energetic agent, and it's biasing the pattern. And this is actually true not just of magnetic fields, it's true of gravitational fields. If you think of the Earth, if a meteorite is whizzing through space and it gets near to the Earth and it falls into the Earth's gravitational field and it plummets to Earth and goes thud, lands on the Earth loses no energy whatever by causing that dramatic fall of the meteor, and all the Earth and all the rocks and things that are scattered asunder and dust in the atmosphere. The Earth has lost no energy at all. In fact, it's gained mass. So it's slightly more attractive to future meteorites. And what I'm suggesting is that morphogenetic fields, like acknowledged gravitational electromagnetic fields, bias probabilities and have a formative effect. So I think that actually, if I were a philosopher of science, I think I'd write a thesis or a book on fields as formal causes, because formal causes are right there in regular, straightforward science, hiding in plain sight.
That's wonderful.
So let me read this.
Okay,
let me read.
Wayne, we need to move on to Cy.
This is
We've got
Charlie.
a lot of folks waiting.
This is just really quick because I have to leave. So I'm going to read it, and then there's also, it seems, a connection between morphic fields and spaces of potentia, as in Whitehead's eternal forms. By the way, these are very different from what people think of as Platonic forms. They're not eternal at all. They're spaces of potentia, which are actually aspects of reality. And what's interesting about them is that since they are not yet actualized, they aren't subject to relativistic limits. So that is, spaces of potentia instantaneously change, and they're inherently non-local. And I think a lot of this is very close to what Rupert is talking about. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, well, I agree, Wayne. I think potentia are very interesting, and I'm very interested in Whitehead, and also in the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is all based on potentia, and I think is one of the most promising ways into quantum mechanics. Anyway, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's Tim Eastman, Untying the Gordian Knot. He brought all this stuff together in a fantastic way.
Thanks. Okay, Cy.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that talk. It's very interesting and kind of new to me. My question is, what about, has anyone looked at the data for something like the efficacy of new medications? For example, there's a lot of that data. There are a lot of new medications coming out all the time, often specific to one country or one region, and then they spread. So would you expect to find a result that as they spread, just like all the other experiments you mentioned, they would become more efficacious, or perhaps less if they're, for example, targeting bacteria that also have morphic resonance? So any comment on that?
Very good question. Well, actually, the efficacy of new medicines tends to get less. And this is partly because the placebo effect wears off. When a new medicine comes on the market in the first place, it's often, this new wonder drug that's going to do all these wonderful things, especially in the US where there's direct-to-consumer advertising by drug companies. They're not allowed to do that in most countries. So people have very high expectations. And then and one researcher in medical research said, when a new drug comes out, use it quick before its effects wear off. It's actually quite well known that some of them get less efficacious. But I think in terms of epidemiology, morphic resonance may be involved. I mean, I don't know enough about epidemiology to speak with any authority, but in general terms, one would expect that if a lot of people develop immune system responses to a new infective agent, antibodies, it might make it easier for other people to develop the same immune response. So what you might expect is that a new viral drug, like a respiratory virus, take COVID as a random example, would be very, very problematic to start with, affect people very severely. And then as time goes on, even without inoculations, would become less and less effective. And this is actually the pattern for most respiratory viruses. I mean, the flu, colds, they constantly mutate. You get new strains that are like Spanish flu. It killed millions of people. But within a few years, nothing to do with viruses, it ceased to be a lethal infection. And people who'd never been exposed to it before were not very much affected. And even among some populations who didn't take the COVID vaccine, levels of resistance to COVID increased considerably. So I think morphic resonance may play a part in epidemiology. I think in relation to bacterial resistance to antibiotics, I'm actually doing some experiments right now in a laboratory in northern England on the evolution of antibiotic resistance in E. coli and S. aureus to chloramphenicol. And I think that if they develop resistance to this particular drug, then if you expose other ones, similar ones to the same drug, they might develop the resistance quicker. And that's the exact experiment I'm doing right now. I can't tell you the results because it's going on as we speak. But that might also help to explain the fact that in the world of bacteria, the evolution of resistance to antibiotics tends to pop up all over the world. And some epidemiologists who've looked at this are puzzled by it. It's not just people flying around the world carrying resistant germs. Some epidemiologists think there's something more mysterious going on, and I think that could be morphic resonance. So it could be involved in a lot of these fields of inquiry.
Joanna?
Hi, Rupert. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited, and thank you, Rupert, for all the work you've been doing for all these years, for intellectual honesty, for your bravery. You've been doing this for a long time. I highly recommend a series of videos on YouTube on a glorious accident that you're part of in '93 that were transformational for me, and you were very brave since then. I have two very quick questions. The first one is, you started as a biologist, but now you speak of morphic resonance as a phenomenon common to all self-organizing systems. So many of us in this new paradigm of biology are trying to revert to an elan vital. There's something special about life. There is agency in life. It doesn't seem like that's what you're saying. You're saying what's special is everywhere. There is a morphic resonance everywhere. Is there something in your view that distinguishes life from non-life? So that would be the first one.
All right. Well, when I started out, I was working in Cambridge on the production of the plant hormone auxin and the polar transport of auxin and its role in development. And we got further in plant development than anyone had in animal development at that stage, this is in the 60s and 70s. But I then realized that actually this chemical explanation isn't going to explain form. And that's why I got interested in morphogenetic fields and form-shaping fields. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, just can you put your question again so I can get the key part of it?
Can we categorize life as
Oh yes,
separate
the why.
from
Yes.
non-life?
Well,
Yeah.
you see, I thought that it was something special about morphogenetic fields, which are special to organisms, and I read, because I was very disillusioned with mechanistic approaches to life, I thought, well, I'll read the people who've most effectively opposed it, namely the vitalists. I read the great vitalist writers. Bergson is one of them. His book Matter and Memory is what immediately triggered the idea of morphic resonance for me, because he argues memories are not stored in brains. I think it's much more general than that. But the other one is Hans Driesch. And Hans Driesch wrote a wonderful book called The Science and Philosophy of the Organism, 1908, and where he explains why you can't possibly explain the features of living organisms just in terms of mechanistic principles, and you need a principle of what he called entelechy. He borrowed this idea from Aristotle, and he borrowed Aristotle's idea of the vegetative soul as a formal cause. I thought this was fantastic. It was much clearer than anything I'd read, much clearer critique of anything I'd seen of mechanistic biology. And, the only person who's really offered as effective a critique since then is Michael Levin. But Driesch anticipates many of the points in Levin. So the point about Driesch was that he was a vitalist. Living organisms have this special organizing principle. So I became a vitalist, and I went around talking about vitalism. And it didn't go over very well in the biochemistry department at Cambridge, where I was working, because, as you know, vitalism has been demonized. It's like calling someone a fascist in a political debate, or a communist if you're in America. It's a kind of catch-all term of disapprobation and polemical attack and so forth. But I was a lot of molecular biologists. I worked with some of the founding fathers of molecular biology. I was friendly with Francis Crick and people like that at Cambridge. And some of them were very, we had arguments, but reasonable arguments. And the point they made was, well, a crystal is self-forming. A virus is like a crystal. It's self-forming. Why doesn't a crystal need a morphogenetic field if an organism does? And what your vitalism basically says, in non-living things, it's business as usual, mechanistic science, unmodified. Whereas in living organisms, we need something else. And then I realized that actually we need something else for crystals too, because I'd always assumed that chemists could just predict the structure of crystals from first principles. It was simple. It turns out it's not simple at all. And protein folding, there's multiple minima, there's all sorts of complications. They can't understand from first principles their formation. So I think we need the same principles for crystals and molecules. And so that meant that I moved from a vitalist paradigm where regular science goes on as usual and only biology has this special extra causal factors or agential activities, to the organismic view, which is that the whole of nature is Whitehead's view, really. From the 1920s onwards, the main alternative to mechanism has not been vitalism, but the organismic view, which says, yes, the vitalists were right. We do need these extra agencies or causal factors in life, but it's not just life. We need them for the rest of nature too. And so I then moved to an organismic model, which is much more intellectually respectful. I mean, it's not why I did it, but it's because I thought it was more true. I thought we actually really need a new model of protein folding and crystals, and that actually most people assume molecular biology is all cut and dry. It can all be explained in terms of physics. It can't. So that's why I generalized this. My first book, A New Science of Life, which the third edition is retitled Morphic Resonance in the US, is still called A New Science of Life in Britain, is mainly about chemistry, crystallization, molecular biology, protein folding, and developmental biology. My second book, which is a much more wide-ranging development of morphic resonance, goes into memory, collective memory, cultural memory, rituals, because I think rituals involve morphic resonance. I think it's why they're powerful. And evolution and parallel evolution and evolutionary plagiarism and so on. So my second book goes much wider, but I was forced to talk, because the theory was so controversial. I mean, it was proclaimed heresy, and it still is. If you look me up on Wikipedia, you'll find I'm a pseudoscientist, and morphic resonance is heresy. Sir John Maddox, the editor of Nature, denounced it as heresy, which meant I couldn't get a job or lab space from then on, but I've been able to survive, fortunately. But because of that extremely highly charged atmosphere, it's been hard to move things on. Even but because of that, I got into conversations with physicists. How could this work? David Bohm was a physicist who took a great interest in this and thought morphic resonance worked very well with his idea of quantum theory. Bernard Carr, who's a British theoretical physicist, thinks that morphic resonance would fit with superstring or M theory. They have 10 or 11 dimensions, and most of these dimensions are currently underemployed. And he thinks that, with all these extra dimensions, morphic resonance could relatively easily be fitted into these physical models. So I've been sort of forced to think about the physical dimensions of this and interact with physicists and chemists through the dynamics of this, developing these ideas, because I don't think you can just have them confined to biology.
Thank you. I think that movement has to be done in a lot of us. I had another question, but I'll just let other people ask. Thank you.
Thanks. Richard?
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Charlie. I have a lot that I would love to discuss, and with apologies to the other people that want to ask questions, I'm going to take the next 2 hours, so you'll just have to put up with that. So let's start here. Rupert, thank you so much. You started by saying that you were moving in contrast to an idea of eternal laws and toward an idea of memory and habit and making things up as you go along, that the principles are always changing and that there's nothing that's written in stone. My current research program, my active research area is about resonance and waves as fields, as principles of creating organized action, memory, shape and form, and cognition. And, I'm trying to understand how it works, right? I'm trying to write down, like, let's write down how it works so that we can, make a model of it and show what's going on. So, my question is, am I on a fool's errand by trying to write down what the invariant laws of morphic resonance are, right? Because are there underlying invariant principles on which your ideas depend, or is everything soft? Is everything made up as it's going along? And what can I do with that? If I grasp something and write it down, if I miss the point.
No, I think there are principles which underlie morphic resonance. One of them is that repetition makes things more probable. I mean, that's a very simple principle. It's really the principle of habit, and we know it from our own personal experience. It's when you learn anything, riding a bicycle, a language, etc., practice and repetition are what enable it to become more habitual, more effective, and work better. So I think these are fundamental principles, and I think that could be modeled mathematically. Now, I also think that morphic resonance depends on waves, and so understanding the nature of waves and vibrations is very important. And I myself have actually been doing research on Faraday waves, published a paper with my son Merlin on Faraday waves in a systematic study of Faraday waves in cylindrical containers.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah. So one thing I was doing there was I wanted to find out whether morphic resonance would occur in a simple vibratory system like that with forced vibrations. That was one motive for doing research on Faraday waves. And at first I thought, well, no, it wouldn't, because they're forced vibrations. Then somebody here in England who does research on Faraday waves told me he'd observed memory effects, that if you do it, if you vibrate a sample, then the next time you vibrate it, it more quickly takes up this Faraday waveform. So that obviously got my interest. And I did rigorous tests with the help of my son Merlin to quantify this. And we found that there were no morphic resonance effects with Faraday waves. It was a borderline case, but I think the reason is it's not a self-organizing system. The whole thing depends on forced vibrations. And the minute you switch the forcing off, then it loses the effect, and which it is a physical forced vibration system. However, wave patterns in self-organizing systems, I think, are of a different nature than forced vibrations in the Faraday waves. But Faraday waves can give us a lot of information about basic wave patterns. And I think one reason that the so-called laws of nature seem to be eternal is that they're basically describing, many of them describing waves, like the Schrödinger equation. These are about waves. And waves have certain properties which remain true over different scales, different dimensions. So I think the study of waves and vibrations is actually fundamental to all this, including nervous activity. And morphic resonance is based on the principle that everything in nature is resonant or has a wave-like nature. Atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, everything's rhythmic, or nothing in nature is like materialists in the 19th century used to think of as little billiard balls. I mean, atoms are vibratory patterns, are vibratory wave patterns. So, no, I don't think it's misdirected at all. I think it's very important, and I think there could be principles, cumulative principles of memory, how different wave patterns compete, how different wave patterns merge, and so on. There's
But do those principles of the waves and the resonance, the properties that remain true and persist over time, are they invariant for all time, like a Platonist might think they are, or are they principles that are made up as we go along as well?
Well, I suspect that they're principles that remain true for all time, but I think they're principles without specific content. I think specific principles about particular waves could apply to many different kinds of waves. The whole point about waves is that the same, like Bessel functions, which can explain the ladder of the patterns, the foldness, fourfold, sixfold, eightfold, these patterns we get with Faraday waves, one can see the same patterns in electrons, in their electronic orbitals. And one can see similar wave patterns in outer space, in plasma waves and things. So these are these things operate over many scales. So I think that there could be certain principles of waves and harmonics, which are general principles. And it's interesting that Pythagoras, who really, I think, gave Plato his idea about eternal forms, got there by studying harmonic systems like flutes and stretched strings. He was looking at wave patterns. So the idea
Yeah,
of eternal principles in maths actually is traced back to the study of waves,
great.
ultimately.
Thank you so much, Rupert.
Wonderful. Okay, Henry.
Oh, hi. Enjoy your talk. So I feel difficult to dealing with is the many phenomena, nature phenomena can be explained by different theory. So is that possible in the future we have some quantitatively, the matrix, because for example, you say you can explain by I agree with you, but at the same time also can be explained by other theory. So how to solve this issue? So this is the first question. I mean, for your future. Yeah.
Well, I design. I'm an experimentalist at heart. I've spent all my life doing experiments. That's what I spend most of my time doing now. And so what I try and do is design experiments that would distinguish between morphic resonance and molecular epigenetics in inheritance, for example, and between morphic resonance and other theories in chemistry. So I'm trying to show that morphic resonance, or an influence at a distance over time, underlies various phenomena in nature. Now, when it comes to could there be alternative theories to morphic resonance, there could certainly be alternative words. I mean, the quantum physicist Lee Smolin has put forward, in the context of cosmology, something that he calls the principle of precedence, that once something's happened, it's more likely to happen again, and the more it happens, the more it will happen. He put this theory forward about 25 years after I proposed morphic resonance. He never mentions morphic resonance, so the principle of precedence doesn't apply to the principle of precedence. But he's afraid of mentioning morphic resonance because it's just too controversial, and he'd rather be able to talk theoretical physics without getting involved in too many controversies. And there could be alternative theories of how morphic resonance might work. David Bohm's theory, the the M theory, or superstring theory. I think basically how I think of it is that, when Michael Faraday was working on electric and magnetic fields in the 1840s, he was describing phenomena. He didn't have a mathematical model. He was describing phenomena which led to the formation of the electric motor and all sorts of practical applications. And then Maxwell came along with electromagnetic field equations based on the ether, the luminiferous ether, vibrations in a mysterious, subtle matter. Then Einstein comes along and says no such thing as the ether. And then quantum electrodynamics comes along and says, well, it all depends on virtual photons appearing from the quantum vacuum field. So theories of electromagnetism have changed over the years, but the basic phenomena have continued. Electric motors still working, still go on working, whether or not you believe Maxwell, Faraday, or quantum electrodynamics. And so I think that what I'm concentrating on is the basic phenomena of morphic resonance, and I think many different theoretical structures could come and go, but I'm trying, and you could call it by different names, like the principle of precedence or whatever. But basically what I'm trying to do is establish that these phenomena really happen.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So one quick question is, do you think, from the chemical to organism to the human's idea, and each different type actually have different power of capability of the field? I mean, according to you, for example, if you measure the temperature measure, change, some molecule is much more dramatic than others. So how to explain the negative one? So is also the how much is exceptional. For example, we know aspirin have so many molecules actually can fairly easy to measure whether or not that stay the same or dramatically increase or just slightly increase. Is that indicate that each of the agent, not agent, same, they actually have different power of the capability in terms of the variable in the field for the competition, for the repetitive, promote the pattern?
I just don't know. The thing is that in terms of morphic resonance, a lot depends on what's happened in the past and how similar what's happening now is to the past. Like in chemicals that have been around for millions of years, you wouldn't observe morphic resonance effects. For new chemicals, you might. But then it's possible that some chemicals would show these more strongly than others because of interference with morphic resonance patterns from similar chemicals in the past. So it's at this stage, it's not possible to say on theoretical grounds how it would work. It's empirical, trying to find out where it works. And if it doesn't work, then what might be the explanations? For example, with diseases, with respiratory diseases, they tend to fade away in a way that would be consistent with morphic resonance. But for some diseases, like smallpox, they don't. The vaccines and so on were a much more powerful way of explaining the disappearance of smallpox. So yes, it raises the question of if there's differences in apparent morphic resonance effects, why are there these differences there? And that, I think, is an empirical research question at the first stage, anyway.
Thanks. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you, Henry. Mary?
Hi. It's so great to have the opportunity to ask these questions. Um, all of my thoughts, they're not quite coherent yet, but it seems to me that there's a an avenue of exploration of the qualities of crystals as related to morphic resonance that could be profitably looked at, um, particularly when we think of time crystals um, and Fröhlich coherence. I guess my question is very close to Richard's question. Are there constants in the morphic fields? But my question is, how do they relate to this tendency of matter to sort of go to a resting state of crystallization, which seems like it's a sort of habituation, and where there's sort of an inertia in that regard, or an habituation and a sort of inertia as and a reduction of energy states. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of a dynamic interplay between homeoretic systems like life And it's sort of like trying to buck the morphic resonances versus sort of giving into them. I hope that was a coherent enough question to be able to respond to in some fashion.
Well, there's crystals, although once they've crystallized, they remain, as it were, frozen in that form, literally frozen in that form for indefinite periods. In the crystallization process, there's a process of becoming or morphogenesis, and it's quite complicated. I mean, take a snowflake, 6 arms. In each snowflake, they're the same as each other, more or less, but every snowflake is different. So there's some kind of internal coordination of morphogenesis in a snowflake that nobody understands. And, when you talk to physicists, they say, oh, well, maybe it's something to do with lattice vibrations within the crystal. But that even crystallization is a really interesting morphogenetic process. Now, in biology, you have the formation of an animal, plant, microbe, fungus, or whatever, moves towards an end or goal, the formation of the mature form, and then it reproduces, and then the same thing happens again. It's an ongoing process. But I don't think it's radically different, and viruses are obviously the in-between case because they sort of crystallize. I don't see any problem with this as it being radically, at least as far as morphic resonance is concerned, and a creode. I think crystals have creodes that canalize pathways of change that lead towards this end point of the crystal. Time crystals are interesting, and I just don't know, I don't understand them well enough to know whether they're relevant. But one thing that I'm always hoping for, hasn't happened yet, is that there are people all over the world making entirely new physical systems. I take nature, I've subscribed to nature for 50 years, and every day, every week I read my copy of Nature, physical copy through the post. And the most interesting areas of science at the moment seem to me materials science and low temperature physics. There's papers in Nature all the time about entirely new systems, coherent systems in twisted graphene layers, near superconducting aspects, Bose-Einstein condensates. All sorts of new kinds of physical holistic systems are being studied. Some of them are relevant to electronics or materials science in various ways. That's why there's money in those areas. But it seems to me that in terms of novel forms of matter, coherently organized, there's probably more being created now than ever before. And those seem to me by far the most interesting areas of physics. I think astronomers and cosmologists are stuck, and quantum physics, they go on arguing about the same old arguments, but where it's really moving forwards is in forming completely new kinds of physical systems. And I would predict that when they make, say, a new Bose-Einstein condensate in low temperature physics, when the whole system behaves like a single quantum state, and it becomes superfluid, superconducting, and so on, that if you do that with a compound over and over again, it should form more readily. And in all these material science things, when they twisted graphene layers and they get the emergence of holistic properties, that if they kept lab records and looked at their notes, that I think it might be happening quicker. I don't think people would notice it normally because, I've done millions of experiments myself, and people get better at doing experiments. You do it one way, it doesn't work very well, you change the conditions, you do it again, it works better. And so very few people rigorously do exactly the same thing over and over again and look at whether it changes. The assumption in lab science is that nature is governed by eternal laws, so everything should be the same whenever you do it. It doesn't matter if it's the 10th time you do it or the first time or the 100th time. And in scientific journals, people used to say representative results are shown in figure 1, like in Journal of Biochemistry, there was the standard phrase. Well, the point is the representative results perfectly well are not representative, they're the best results, and people just don't look back through their data to see whether there's been changes. I think if people in materials science labs started looking carefully to see is anything actually changing over time, they might find it is. So I keep hoping that somebody's going to say memory effects discovered in twisted graphene layers or something like that. Hasn't happened yet, but I keep hoping I'll open Nature one day and find that it has.
Nice. Awesome. Catherine?
Hi, Rupert. I want to echo all of the kudos for bravery that Joanna set forth earlier. You've long been a hero of mine for your courage and tenacity. I also like that, if I'm right about this, that you honor the experiences of the organism. I might be pushing you too far here. I'm an organicist myself, but I think that there should be much more authority placed on what the organism actually provides for us than our limited interpretations of what that might mean. So, like you, I'm interested in the origins of form itself, what that is, how is it bounded in terms of self-identity in particular, which is sort of one of the big mysteries in biology. But I'm also an emotion researcher, and I think that emotion is one of the direct ways that we interact with whatever physics is going on with morphic resonance. In fact, I sent you an email, and the lovely Pam Smart, I believe, said that she would be passing it along to you because I had some ideas about connecting it with the emotion literature. But
I did
my
actually
question,
reply. Maybe I forgot to press send, but I did actually write a reply to you.
oh my gosh, I do
Well,
that all the
I'll
time.
dig it out and send it. Yeah, if I
Oh, that's
haven't already.
wonderful. That's wonderful. The one thing I wanted to really ask you about now, which no one else has brought up, is I think that there are most of the answers that are going to be found are going to come from quantum theory, quantum mechanics, and the implications of all of that. But I just wanted to ask if you're familiar with Wojtek Zurich's new ideas, or he just came out with a book called Quantum Darwinism. And he is the quantum theorist that is famous for the whole idea of decoherence, how quantum phenomena crystallize into coherent physical experiences, and not just experiences, but literally information in the environment. So in his book, he talks about the external environment as both a witness and a record. And to me, that sounds very much like exactly the territory we're in. We're thinking about boundaries between organism and environment and fields and all of that. But that coupled with Scott Gilbert, the developmental biologist, who talks about evolution as the environment, the external environment, as both an instructor and a selector. So all of those things together imply to me that there's a lot more meat out there in terms of physics and developmental biology for morphic resonance, particularly if you think about how our perceptions, our sensory capacities might be. And of course, I think that emotion is central to that, and I'd love to talk to you about it sometime.
Well, I agree that emotions are a really important part because we've had the whole of science has been distorted enormously by molecular biology and neo-Darwinism on the one hand, and computer science on the other, where and artificial intelligence and so on, where obviously as if all our mental activity is just algorithmic processing. Well, obviously it isn't, and a lot of people have pointed that out. That emotions are an absolutely key part of it. What's that Portuguese chap, Descartes' error?
Damasio.
Oh, yes, Damasio.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, obviously, our emotions involve the whole body, and the whole thing becomes a resonant system, not just
Yep.
a little region of the brain. So
Yep.
I think emotions are obviously involve the entire body. And in fact,
Yep.
if we try and there's a lot of talk now about panpsychism, and people like try to say atoms and electrons even may be conscious in some way. Well, I think actually if one thinks about that, then they do have the basic elements of emotion, attraction, and repulsion. An electron can be attracted towards a positive charge, repelled by a negative charge. Attraction and repulsion are some of the most fundamental of emotions, and yet we see the physical analogy or the physical analog in electric and magnetic phenomena. And so I think that if one were looking for trying to think what's it like to be an electron, then I would start from its emotions, its attractions, its repulsions, and one would get quite a long way because all matter has this. I suppose neutrons don't have electric things, but they're still subject to the strong nuclear force, and otherwise they wouldn't stay in the atom. So there's a sense of being together with other things that gives them a kind of a nuclear community of nuclear particles. So I agree. I think that if we look at these most fundamental aspects of emotion, they run right through nature, and I think we can get some illumination from physics, but not from most physicists, because most of them are so steeped in Platonic thinking. As most mathematicians are Platonists, because they live in that world of maths is eternal and somehow beyond space and time, and they think that mathematical equations are somehow reified in the physical world. They sometimes use the word reified. That what comes first are mathematical equations, the Platonic reality beyond space and time, then gives rise to this world, which is a non-evolutionary view. And it's very hard to get most physicists to take an evolutionary perspective, even though they have an evolutionary cosmology. That's why Lee Smolin is very unusual among physicists in saying, well, wait a minute, guys, if we're in an evolutionary cosmos, maybe the regularities of nature evolve too, rather than all being fixed by laws at the beginning of time. But he's an outlier. This is not a big debate among physicists because they're so steeped in this kind of mathematical Platonism. There are exceptions, but if we're going to find ways forward, I don't think they're going to come from most physicists. I think the one who's most promising, in my view, I've never met her, is Ruth Kastner, with her transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, building on Kramer's work, which is all about potentia, and there's all of physics depends on potentialities which are not yet physical. The Schrödinger equation is all about possibilities that haven't yet happened, or propensities. So I think there's rich seam to mine there, but I don't think there's not much sign of many of them doing it because of this strong disposition towards maths.
I hear that.
I found this problem with, I mean, you close to it because Stuart's into kind of later developments of general systems theory and so on, but I found this with the general systems theory people. They have an organismic approach to biology, but a lot of them are into mathematical modeling, and as soon as you get into that, it's all about eternal equations, and it's not terribly receptive to things like morphic resonance.
I totally hear you. And I have found relief from that and lots of inspiration in Lou Kaufman and his extensions of George Spencer Brown's laws of form, because they are really getting out of mathematics. They have a whole language of marks and distinctions from which all higher mathematics sort of flows. But they talk about the mark being something first made out of nothing, that sort of divides the subject from the object, the context. It's a beautiful stuff. And it gets at the idea of identity and identity boundaries, as well as subjective framings. So there's lots to say there, but thank you for this. I look forward to hearing your email and seeing you at some point. In fact, I'm right there with you on Ruth Kastner. She and Stu wrote a paper together. And when you think about identity, which is the difference between what an emotional piece of information versus a cognitive thought, is all about the self. And that's the key to knowing the distinction and seeing its steeper function. But identity is actually both a part and a whole. And if you think about it from the perspective of electron, the one in the valence is sort of like a collective identity. The ones inside are parts. So that story can go all the way down, I think. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much. Great. Joanna, I see you've got your hand up again.
I saw I had a chance to ask my second question. I'll try to be very quick. Rupert, so what I understand from morphic resonance is that what repeats happens more. You said this relates, of course, to Eastern philosophy. I've delved a lot in it. What I don't see in morphic resonance is what we see in Eastern philosophy of purpose or the direction or of goals of where we are going as life, as a universe. You said before in this call that organisms' goals are to survive and reproduce. I think there is more. Do you see more purpose in the universe? How does morphic resonance relate to purpose and goal in the universe, particularly in the context of Eastern philosophy?
Difficult question. I mean, there's a long-standing debate about whether evolution as a whole has a purpose. I mean, so organisms within the evolutionary process have a purpose, but when you look at the philosophy of evolution as a whole, someone like Teilhard de Chardin, for example, thought that the purpose of it was something to do with consciousness reaching an omega point and going beyond the limitations of this planet and individuality and so on. But he also had to take into account the fact that any idea that evolution has a purpose to do with human consciousness has to explain the fact there's millions of species of butterflies and insects and things and all sorts of flowers and nothing to do with, as far as we know, the emergence of human consciousness. So part of evolution appears to be what Indians would call lila, just play, or creativity for its own sake. And so I think that is one of the purposes of evolution. If one looks at the actual variety of life and variety of the cosmos, it's almost as if every possibility has to be entertained, or is entertained if it can be. I mean, countless stars, galaxies, planetary systems, and on this planet, so many different forms of life. One of the purposes must be variety or creativity. Whether there's one overall goal, and that overall goal is everything ultimate fusion of consciousness with the divine source or not, I don't know. I think maybe it is. But it's not easy to apply the goal of evolving consciousness. I mean, in Eastern philosophy, basically they think that the goal of human consciousness is to achieve union with the ultimate conscious source. That's the purpose of moksha or liberation, a kind of spiritual vertical takeoff. But the rest of the universe is caught in samsara, endless cycles of reincarnation and repetition and suffering, and going then the whole universe in Hinduism devolving to the last age in time, the Kali Yuga, when all things fall apart. There's disorder, disharmony between men and women, between nations, between humans and nature. I mean, it looks very much like the modern world, Kali Yuga. That's in there, I think, the stage of degeneration as things go downhill. I mean, we like to see it as progress, everything going uphill. But they have a different model of what's going on, and the ultimate telos is the universe is dissolved and then it's recreated again. It's a cyclical model of the golden age, and everything starts going wrong all over again. So it's not exactly an upwards and onwards purpose in most Eastern philosophy. It's at best a kind of cyclic repetition, and the main purpose is for spiritual purposes, for individuals to get off it, or in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, even though they can get off, to come back and help liberate all sentient beings as bodhisattvas. But that's the ultimate aim of that. The bodhisattva thing is basically the extinction of all suffering and the liberation of all sentient beings. So it's certainly not a kind of onwards and upwards progressive movement of the kind we're used to.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Richard, I had you with your hand up again. Is that
Yeah,
true?
thank you. I'm so grateful for that last exchange. It's really great. I wonder, Well, I take issue with the idea of organisms being within an evolutionary process, Rupert. I would prefer a viewpoint where we think of the evolutionary process as being one of the substrates of memory within an organismic process of morphic resonance. I wonder how that lands with you.
You mean seeing the whole of life as a kind of organism?
Well, the processes of morphic resonance or resonance that produces shape and form and cognition and capabilities of learning and memory, that comes first. Biological evolution is just one of the substrates that gets involved in that.
Well, yes. I mean, I, I do have that kind of view myself.
Mm.
And I also think the whole universe is best seen as a kind of organism. You know, the well, Plato has that in the Timaeus. The whole universe is in with the world soul, and you get it in Neoplatonism and Plotinus. The soul of the world is that which shapes the whole world and gives rise to conscious beings within it, like a kind of fractal budding off within.
Yeah.
All the souls of all things come out of this overall organism, the world soul, the anima mundi. And that is within God, which is the ultimate source of consciousness. But it's only within the world soul that you have memory, because it's only within the world soul that you have time.
Ah.
Once you're beyond the world soul, you're outside the realm of time. So in Plotinus, and indeed in Plato, you have these sort of, this is an eternal transcendent realm, the mind of God, which is beyond, but then within the created realm, there's memory and there's a superorganism. I mean, in the Hindu model, one of the models is that the cosmic person, Purusha, is created, is well, the whole universe, this cosmic person. And in Christian theology, the cosmic Christ is the first creation is of the Logos, is the universe, and that this is an organism in itself within which all else happens. So, I mean, I think those are perfectly, I mean, one can take this bigger picture, but when I'm designing experiments, when I'm designing my E. coli experiments, for example, I was just designing a new part of the experiment today. Then I'm working in a more limited framework of, what happens if you expose them to this concentration of chloramphenicol.
Mm. So when you were talking to Kate, you mentioned that the mathematical Platonists is something that you want to contrast with or distance yourself from. This idea of enduring principles that were equations that were written there and they explain things. But when I'm trying to understand what the enduring principles of resonance are and how that creates shape and form and learning, I find myself in the maths department, right? Like when I'm like Plato, I'm thinking about harmonics and ratios and things, and I'm doing maths, and that's the department that I reside in.
Well, I'm working with a colleague on the mathematics of Faraday waves at the moment, and he's, the Ritz-Rayleigh equation, Bessel functions, this kind of thing. I've been immersed in this. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm out of my depth, but he kindly explains it to me. And we've got a joint paper we're writing at the moment. We've almost finished it, which we're going to submit to the Proceedings of the Royal Society A. I've had papers in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, but I never thought I'd ever be in a position to have one in Proceedings of the Royal Society A, Mathematics, Engineering and Physics. And that is indeed all about the mathematics of vibrations. And so, yes, I mean, the mathematics has something to tell us, but it doesn't tell us anything much about memory or morphic resonance processes, because the equations, that's not part of those mathematical systems. It's like idealized waveforms and interference patterns and so forth, and modes, circular modes, circumferential modes of vibration within these.
So the maths tells us like the space of possibilities, but it doesn't tell us any of the content.
No, and it doesn't tell us about the evolution in time of processes in nature. I mean, The equations, if the morphogenetic fields of the dinosaurs could be formulated in mathematically, then the mathematics would in principle have been the same at the moment of the Big Bang as when the dinosaurs were roaming the Earth, as it is today when they're no longer roaming the Earth. The equations would be completely unaffected by anything that actually happens.
Got it. Thank you.
Guys, we're tragically at the end of our 2 hours, even though we're having such a splendid conversation. And I just I feel obliged as host to kind of wrap it up. Although I'm going to leave the meeting open in case some of you want to keep going, but I'll just interrupt to say thank you to our guest and for everyone who needs to move along, by all means do so. But anyway, thank you so much to everyone who took part today and joined in because this was really a fabulous discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for organizing it. I actually have to go now, so I'm going to sign off, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and it's a real delight to be able to discuss with scientific colleagues some of these questions. Not one I have very often, I have to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we deeply appreciate it, Rupert.
Mm.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much. Catherine, I'm sorry I cut you off. You still had your hand up. You're you're muted. Let's see.
Yeah, no
There
worries.
you go. Okay, great. Yeah. What a great
I can follow up
discussion.
with him.
Yeah, that's
Is
great.
Richard still here? Richard still here? Or did he sign off?
I think he must have signed off. Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, great. Yeah, it sounded like he really wanted to follow up with you, so that's terrific. And I guess you have his contact or do you need me to
Oh, no,
connect
no,
you
that's
guys?
fine. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Appreciate it.
Great.
Well, it's good to see you all.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and kill the meeting. Although Dina, I need to talk to you. Josh, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Hey, how's it
Hey,
going? I thought you
good. How are
signed.
you?
I thought you disappeared. I called on people in the order they appeared in my
Oh, really?
in
Maybe
my
I'm glad you got my message. I was just concerned because from my view, it looked like people who had their hand up longer. Uh, but maybe it's just a Zoom weirdness.
I don't know. I think it was right. I think the order it appeared on my screen was correct because
Probably since you're
I
the host.
definitely, well, yeah, I don't know, but I mean, definitely Wayne was first, and then it went from there. So it seemed
All
like
right.
that
All
way.
right.
That was
Anyway, yeah, I'm
amazing.
here. I just got to the city, so I was on the
Okay.
train that whole time. Now I'm walking down the street in Midtown. So
Okay. Sorry, the inconvenient timing.
no, it's great, and I can stay on actually if you want to talk a little.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's see. Should we set up another meeting right quick and do this separately? I need to end the recording on this one. Um, let's see.
Yeah, you want to just do a phone call? You want to do